tricking someone into doing a podcast by always having interesting new shit to share with them.
what, what should we talk about today?
Well, let's call this like experimental half-baked ideas.
Okay, experimental half-baked ideas.
Yes,
I'm
because
I'm full of those.
oh, aren't we all just starting to rise? Because yeah, there were a few things that I wanted to chat with you about that I thought could be interesting for people who are open to things that maybe be less polished, but also very relevant.
Let's
You
imagine let's imagine we're at a brunch and we just got through the heat wave here in Portland. Now it's a nice day today. So let's imagine we're all out at brunch with our friends, having an
very good.
interesting conversation.
Yes, this is exactly the type of light conversation I do hope to have with my friends at brunch, which is why I have a very limited social circle.
I bet, yeah, in our life, like the concept of going out to brunch with friends is like, I remember doing that like 15 years ago.
Yes.
I'm trying to get
Yeah.
back. I told you that, this 20 years of aging research has been such a slog, and I've come to realize I might be slightly on the spectrum, which helps me focus on things. But it's also been kind of like it's been hours and hours of like staring at characters and so much. And I kind of think of it as like pushing the rock up the hill, kind of thing. And also trying to bring it out into a world where no one really knows the material very much. So you're always showing up like, and people are kind of looking at you like you're kind of odd, going, the channels are blood vessels, what,
Mhm.
Um, but now that's really kind of done. We've got a lot of it in the bag. Although the archaeology side is so big, we've just actually, looked at a small portion of it. But so what I'm trying to change, long and short, is I'm trying to change my life to the death march of work to the life of interesting dinner parties. That's my new story.
This is a good thing. This is a really good thing. And so we can start it with virtual brunches like this one.
Virtual
Um,
brunch.
and then we can
We
turn it into something more
we can call this podcast virtual brunch number one.
virtual brunch number 1. I like it. I like it.
All
We'll
right.
do it.
Lay
Yes.
your wisdom on me.
Well, it's a conversation really. So, before we started, you were starting to say that you were working on developing like a qigong, let's say, set that's working with the solar motion. So maybe first, if I can keep my own mouth shut for 10 minutes, why don't you share what the solar motions are?
Yeah, I have to thank you. And I was saying before we hit record, I was saying in Portland we just had this really blistering heat wave, and we were stuck in the house. And today's the first day of getting out, and I was thanking you for your wisdom about the sun. And I hope we have a talk about the sun just someday on our podcast. And it's really changed how I think about the sun and my relationship to it. But I was thanking you so much because now in the morning I go out and I do self care for an hour by laying in the sun when the UV light's low. And then I've been trying to develop this kind of qigong or very simple exercise program that follows how plants move in accordance with the sun. And in aging medicine, we call those the solar motions. So I know that everything in the universe and in our world is really sun based. The sun sets the rhythms, the sun provides the heat. Everything forms around its motions. There are other motions like the moon and the seasons, but the sun is really key. And in the Neijing, they have these passages where they talk about how watersheds, Taiyang, Yangming, Taiyin, how they open and close and pivot. And there's an internal and external pivoting, opening and closing motions they describe. But what those mean haven't been clear to people. You can hear all sorts of descriptions about that, which kind of sound good, but don't really pass the sniff test sometimes. And so I was really thinking about this issue maybe 10 years ago, 10 years ago, when I was down with my mom and she was going through her elderly dying phase in her 90s. And so we were down there taking care of her, and out in front of her house was a sunflower field. And in French, sunflowers are tournesol. That means they turn to the sun. So I had a lot of time on my hands, and I was thinking about these passages. And I'd sit and look at the sunflowers, and in the morning they are looking to the east, and in the evening they're facing the west. And there's also something else that happens during the night. They droop forward, and in the morning they stand up. And I was wondering, could this be what they're talking about? Patterns of motion of nature, how it open, closes, and breathes in accordance with the sun, the phases of the sun. And so I started to think about that, and the outer phases were pretty clear. Like the sun stands up, that's an opening. It bends over, that's a closing. It pivots, that's a turning. The inner ones were a little harder until I realized that there's an internal motion that's also happening going up and down a central axis. So in the nighttime, things go back into their root, and in the morning, they come back up to the top. You could also use the seasons. So in wintertime, it's the same as nighttime and so forth. And then it started to make sense to me. And the key was looking at the Neijing sinew channel descriptions. Those are how what we would call the muscles are organized in the body around 12 channels. And what the key that the penny that dropped was seeing that when those channels are activated, they follow these patterns of the sunflower. And I was like, whoa, that's what they're talking about. So that there's and in our body, because body follows the patterns of plants and nature, we are nature, not like nature. We also follow these opening and closing motions. So we have muscles that kind of open our spine and to the sun, and then close us down into a ball into the nighttime, and turn us from left to right as the sun is moving. And then internally along the spine, there's also this motion from the root, which is in your pelvis and your dantian, up and through your heart, up into the outer parts of your body. So I've just been playing with this qigong thing where I pretend I'm a plant, and I tell you, it's pretty amazing and it's simple, which is what I love.
This is cool. So basically, I before you shared that, I'd been kind of uh, germinating on this idea, and I like to kind of bring different maps together. And I'm doing a very deep dive on the nervous system for the past few years. My own health and life story has brought me to need to learn the nervous system and the development of the nervous system from soup to nuts in order to figure out how I could thrive and help other people thrive. And so what I've been kind of a recent, I suppose, breakthrough in my understanding and in my own health, and it very closely relates to what you're talking about here, is the extremely underappreciated but outsized role of a part of our nervous system called the cerebellum. And the cerebellum, which the word just means little brain, and so you know this, but it's located right here, at the base of the occiput, and it's fascinating. It, as I say, it plays this outsized role. So first of all, it contains 80% of the neurons of the brain. So it's probably
Oh,
not one that should be skipped, and I think part of my excitement and frustration is, like, that the cerebellum had been presented to me as relevant before, but it was in a laundry list of things. It wasn't presented perhaps as
right.
it should have been in a hierarchical way of, like,
We're all about the cortex and
yeah, we're
the
all
brain.
about the cortex. Well, I'll tell you
Yeah,
what, those networks, the cortex networks don't work so well if the cerebellum isn't talking to them. Um, and so the cerebellar issues are related to all sorts of developmental issues. But in my own case, I dealt with a lot of different health issues over the years with like autoimmunity and chronic fatigue and fibromyalgia. And over that time, I'd made a lot of progress, but most recently, figuring out that I needed to focus on my cerebellum and give it some activation lifted my fatigue profoundly in a kind of very immediate way. And I'm sure a lot of that is because of the years of work I had done preceding that. But at the same time, it seemed to me that it was quite central. But now, if we think about what does it do as it relates to, let's say, a plant or these solar motions, now we're kind of getting somewhere really exciting. So first is that the cerebellum we can organize in three different like levels or layers, kind of going from center out, and it has a left and a right. The center or the midline cerebellum is all about the kind of spinal motions and the axial motions and eye movements, and so I'm gonna kind of maybe suggest that we add eye movements maybe to the qigong that you're developing.
Ah, okay.
Is it
And
real
spinal motions being flexion, extension, and rotation, or
Yes, and all of it. So, like, the kind of the overall theme, and I think this really goes with your ideas about, health in the body being about, finding places where something isn't breathing and restoring breath. This kind of maybe neurological way of talking about that is all about our internal mapping. So, d
yeah.
are our maps specific and are they accurate? Because then can we use consciousness to access those parts, or are they offline?
And where I was just talking to a patient about this yesterday, and we were talking about vertigo, and and they were also a practitioner, and I was saying, well, that's actually where we treat for balance. It's all
Mhm.
about the back of the neck right there. I wonder, would you call it? Would you think of would it be analogy be that the cerebellum is like the bridge of a ship in a certain way, like steering its motions or something, or would that not be accurate?
Or maybe I don't know enough about how ships work to even say
I'm thinking of
either
one of those
way.
big container ships, but up on the top is like, the people on the
Yeah.
bridge.
Well, maybe the answer is maybe. Maybe I'll tell you a little bit more about what I've discovered, and you can tell me if it fits, because it's
Okay,
gonna be a few things, So, one is that the cerebellum has always been thought of to be have to do something with movement, so that if it's,
right.
not working well, we get
You're kind of
tremors,
shaky if you don't
you're
have it
kinda
developed.
shaky. Yeah, but what's more increasingly understood is that's really important for cognition. So
Ah,
that's interesting, but it's really doing where it comes to movement is that, let's say we're talking about an intentional movement, then I want to move my right hand here. So my left motor cortex is going to send some instructions to the cerebellum and to the hand, and then the cerebellum is going to do some error checking and
and
correcting.
it coordinates. It's like the supervisor in a way, right,
It's
or
the
something.
supervisor, and it's like checking. It's like, "You said you wanted to do this, and this is what you're doing. Does that add up? Like, I wanna reach my cup of tea without spilling it or knocking it over. This is what I intend to do. Am I succeeding, or do I need to change and fine-tune that a bit?"
Hmm.
Um, and so the middle of the cerebellum starts is mapping for the spine and the eyes, and then as we get, lateral, now we get into fine motor and these things, and that lateral is also going with all of the sexy stuff of the prefrontal cortex, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, which is like the pinnacle of human evolution and achievement. That does not work so well if your lateral cerebellum isn't working. So we're talking about flexion and extension. We're talking about more complex rotation, but ultimately we're talking about mapping. And the I think one of the sort of profound realizations, I mean, there's been kind of layers of it, but is this role with fatigue? Because from this perspective, fatigue is a protective mechanism that your body creates to help keep you safe.
Right, I've heard you say that before.
Mhm.
Like, "Don't move, it's not safe to move."
Don't move is not safe because you're not doing a good job of predicting your environment because you don't have a very detailed map of your body, so you don't really know how to move it very well. We tend to think of fatigue as like an empty car tank, and that's just yes, that can exist. There are people who are starving. It's just not the typical in most people's practices or in most people's lives who are watching this. So just because it exists doesn't mean that it's generally true. So for most people, and if you say if someone's overweight and fatigued, then they do have calories. They're just not accessing them. So the
Right,
fatigue,
we've talked about that before. It's not they're actually starving in a certain way. They're not moving.
right?
And when we see the not moving also, it's sometimes a psycho-emotional response to trauma, like, and people respond to trauma in different ways, but there's one subtype of people who some people just get really anxious and so forth. But there's a subtype where, like, not moving is the strategy to danger, like you say, not only that your body's not working right, but danger, like, "Don't move and I won't," and then you see that, and then over time, of lifetime of not moving, that get ingrained instruction certainly would probably play back on the brain and the cerebellum, I would think.
1,000,000%. And in fact, there's a really interesting literature that's coming out that's linking um, like a kind of whole host of trauma responses to its directly to its effects on the vestibular system. And I want to just clarify for people who aren't as familiar with these areas is that the vestibular system kind of plugs directly into the cerebellum. So
Yeah,
they're working together. So we they're not identical because the cerebellum might have kind of broader other things that it does aside from vestibular. But vestibular system is basically that we've got these five motion detectors in each ear, and they're sending information about where our head and body is in space. And if if your vestibular system is off, then your whole sense of self is off.
right. And there's that way that you experience yourself through the tensegrity of your fascia system and how it moves either as a unity or in disparate parts or not at all. Yeah. Very
Exactly.
interesting.
So with trauma, there's evidence that and people experience trauma different ways, and we could even think about like the whether the left or the right is more predominant or coming offline, but people can feel this feeling of like derealization where they don't feel real, and some of that is like a literally that the vestibular system that is your sense of where you are in relation to gravity. If that is
Right.
altered, then this is now your experience of moving through the
That's so
world.
fascinating because, in the Neijing, and big theme is also about guest host and also about what's the difference between you and other things. Like, and that is such a deep question because most of the universe is not self-based. Clouds, rivers, waters, galaxies, and so forth. They don't have an agenda particularly. So we say they move with the Tao, meaning they don't have a intentionality. But something happened with us where we did get that sense of being separate, and that's a whole different podcast. Um, but a lot of what we're facing now with nature and our evolution and how we survive or don't, comes back to how we move through space in relationship to other things. Like, for example, if we tell the story that we're separate from nature, then we're moving in relationship to other things in a different way. But you're saying also if our brain is not functioning, we don't even have that. We can't even get started with that because we don't have that sense of self. Is that
100%.
correct?
That's totally correct, and it's the implications of it are profound because, maybe if you're listening, you'll have different, relationships to this topic. So maybe you've thought about this a lot, maybe you've never thought about this before, but I think one of the things that really has blown my mind is that someone can have this problem their entire life and not really be aware of it because they don't really know anything else, and they can be pretty darn functional. So when in the past, if I thought about these issues, it's like, sure, some people come out with severe disabilities and they must experience the world in a different way, and they have all these deficits, and you can spot them easily, kind of deal. But I had these deficits, and I didn't have any language for them because it was all that I knew. But I had a driver's
Right.
license, and I had some degrees, and I had traveled, so it wasn't like it's not so much that it makes you fall down, and yet it informs everything about how you move through the world
And there's that
because
there's that thing which is our blessing and our curse, which is how quickly we accommodate to things and how quickly they become normal. And then it's like the fish swimming in the ocean who doesn't know about the water, you know.
exactly.
And then all of a sudden, like, and that goes back to stories, which we'll talk about more. But the story becomes like the water that we live in, and then you don't think it's you or you have a problem. You think it's the way the world is.
Mm,
And you don't actually, that's one reason I think it's interesting why we heal in pairs. You know, you can go off to a cave and meditate, but mostly we don't heal by ourselves. And one thing is that we don't see ourselves very well. And there's also this thing called a blind spot, like in your eye, we have that too. That's built in that, when someone comes to see us, we see right away there's a problem and they don't see it because it's built into the way they experience moving through the world. And so, but that's very interesting too, because the way you have conversations about that is very interesting. Because in the beginning, people don't even think that's an issue or a thing, do you
right.
know? And so there's this kind of way in clinical practice that it's all, there's this thing about you intervene in the body, they feel something, and then they go, oh, that feels different. And then that's like a stepping stone for a conversation. I don't know, I'm kind of rambling off here, but you can
No,
bring me back
absolutely.
to
Well,
topic.
what that reminds me of is, most of my practice is actually online. It's kind of kind of the little bit of the opposite of the way that you teach us, and I kinda like having those both of those lenses. But, with this format, I'm able to help people all over the world. But one thing I realized when I started studying the brain and also, just studying my own case, I have a lot of data on me, so I'm kind of interested in myself as an N of one. And one thing I'd realized a few years ago was that my labs were worse than pretty much all of my patients, but I was kind of functioning and walking around. And so, with working with people with complex chronic illness, I realized that people kind of fall into two categories. I roughly call them the overfeelers and the underfeelers. And so the overfeelers, and I say over and under only because since they have chronic illness, there's already a pathology built in. These are not people who are functioning well at the moment. And so the overfeelers are very sensitive to their environment and to the people around them. They can usually describe themselves as empaths, and they're picking up on everyone's energies, and they have poor boundaries. And I mean, neurologically, that's not a judgment, right? It's just like they can't sense where they end and others begin. They're kind of too connected, and so they might be able to feel Wi-Fi and to pick up on like parts per billion of mold. And then the other category are a bit like how I was presenting, which is like putting one foot in front of the other, no really major complaints. But when you start looking at the labs and the data, like there's something seriously wrong. An example of a patient like this who is someone who saw me after this is that he was perfectly healthy until he had a heart attack. So clearly he was inflamed
It
leading
just
up to that.
broke. It just broke
He
all of
he
a
just
sudden.
broke, but the check engine light had been disengaged.
I think there's a deep sense of poignancy about this. I think when I work with people or think about my own life, and partly it's the sense that the clock is ticking. I mean, time, of course, that's a whole other podcast. And if you talk to physicists, they're like, "Well, we don't understand time, and the way you experience it is not the way it is." But anyway, it's that sense of that you when you're born that we're given something precious. You're a coherence of light and breath, and that's like, and in the universe, that's amazing. Everything that had to happen to be on a planet with the right temperature and water and so far from the sun and a magnetic field and all those kinds of things that you would develop a coherence and become a person. And I think most people, unless they're damaged, know there's something sacred. My life is something sacred. And then we get talked out of that over time. Well, it's actually your main benefit is how much money you can make and like how popular you are, whatever it is. And I think, when you get to people and especially when you see them older, and if they've been living in one of these dysfunctional bubbles, I don't know what we call it, the poignancy is you realize, oh, wow, there was a real wasted opportunity in a certain way. And so much time was lost. I mean, I don't know about, but I'm going from my experience of working with people for 40 years
Mm.
and in my own life too. I don't know if you feel that, but I think people have that sense deep inside that time is moving and they're not involved in the same way in life as they should be. I don't know. And yet
Well,
we have to get up and do our daily things and take our kids to
yeah.
school.
Well,
Um,
one thing that brings up for me, which is a kind of a related idea, is that when I was a kid and a teenager and in my early 20s, I felt very invincible, which I think is pretty normal. You're not kind of spending too much time contemplating your own demise. You're young and you have energy and you're doing these things, and so you don't necessarily follow uh, like wise advice about how to live your life for the future because you feel like that you're untouchable. But one thing that I notice, and that's also shown now in the literature, is that people are losing their vitality younger and younger, and they're getting sick
oh yeah,
earlier
and more
and
more
earlier.
things like cancer rising, yeah,
Yes.
all sorts of things.
So, so even before the pandemic, a large study came out based on insurance data that was showing that the typical decline in health in the United States was happening at age 29. So if
Right.
you'd asked me when I was a kid, when do people start losing their luster? I would have said in your 60s, but something like that, but not 29. And so the upshot of that, which I think is a bit like sad and hopeful, is that if you'd been giving me advice about how I should preserve my health when I was in my teens, I wouldn't have really listened to you. But when I have younger people in my practice now, I see that they're really listening to what I'm saying in a way where they've kind of lost their innocence a little bit early because either they're not doing well, their friends aren't doing well, and they see that they actually need to pay attention. So in a way, we might have kids and younger people who are actually not taking their life for granted and not taking their health and their vitality for granted because they can see either that they're already losing it, they never had it, their friends didn't have it, so maybe they're kind of maybe becoming wise early, and yet that may be not necessarily
That's
a
the
bad
good thing
thing.
about crisis, and you see that also working, when people have life-threatening illnesses, which I see a lot of that. Um, there's certainly challenges there, but one of the great opportunities is people, they are ready to like try something else,
Mm,
and it's the same, I think, whether, you're having the life-threatening illness or nature is having a life-threatening illness. It's the same. It's like we need to do something. And but one of the things, I think that's causing anxiety for people is that when they look around them for answers as to what that thing might be or a thing might be, they don't see it clearly because right now there's a lot of chaos in the that sphere where we have conversations, and there's been this interesting degradation in judgment, which I think is so interesting. Like before cell phones and screens and everybody was tied into everything, and particularly before AI and things, there was a way that people developed this skill for judgment, meaning contemplating something over time without rushing into an answer and then coming to a thoughtful decision. And that seems to be rapidly being degraded to some degree, first with screens and social media, where you need to have an answer right away. But now it's also with AI, it's a whole different issue. That I don't want to go down that road.
mm.
Um, so there's a lot of things all together in this kind of very rich stew, nature struggling, the heat waves, the world on fire, all these things happening, and AI and things like that are really changing how our brain works, and how we think about each other and how we make decisions. And in the sense of that, is in the middle of that is still this impulse, which is inherent to life and the universe, which is the desire to heal and to become whole again, or to make sense of something. And I always say, like the inner motion of the universe always tends towards healing. It doesn't sometimes it doesn't look like that in a tornado when everything's broken up. That's just part of the way nature breathes. But the tendency towards things, it's with patience, we use that tendency all the time. If we put things in motion and make a space for healing, the natural tendency is it will go there. So there's all these things happening right now, and our brains are certainly part of that. I don't know, maybe I went off topic there a bit, but
Yeah, no, well, there's a lot of I mean, a lot of interesting directions to go in with that. Like, one that I think about sometimes is because we were talking about the brain and cerebellum and the eyes, is that if you're spending a lot of time I'm
I
gonna
have
also
house,
turn off my
hang
hey?
on one second. I've got house painters coming.
Oh,
All right, where were
yeah.
we?
Wait. So, if we're thinking a little bit about, how our brain works and our eyes work and the cerebellum is coordinating them, then if we are, looking at this device that's kinda close to our body, that's just it's a fixed distance away, we're not kinda moving it back and forth,
Right.
and we're narrowed in on it, then it's a bunch of things are happening. So aside from the content and perhaps the emotions that that's triggering, or the reward nucleus that it's burning out, or whatever it's going on, creating disgust, all these
With
things
your pocket slot machine, as I call
with
it.
with your pocket slot machine. Um, Also, neurologically, a couple of things. One is that you are using your eye muscles in a certain way. So I mentioned before that we've got these like kind of five motion detectors in our ears, and they're kind of hooked up to these six muscles around each eye. And so we have this really cool thing where when we move the eye, I've just turned this way and my eyes knew to go that way, and that's a reflex, and that has to do with what's going on in my inner ears and my muscles, and it's all coordinated. But if I'm spending like 8 hours a day locked into this, then it's doing something very specific with my eye muscles and my brain activation. It's creating like a certain setting that I'm training. So it's actually like narrowing the scope of kind of what I can do in a way because I'm training this and I'm locking this
Right,
in.
and actually, it's your phone is training you. You know, there's some basic questions about technology, and one of them I like to ask is, does your technology work for you or do you work for it? You know? And what I mean by that is if you're staring at your phone, it's giving you constant feedback about how to change your behavior to work the way it works. And it's
Yes.
got a whole sense of bells and whistles, and if you get them right, all the bells and whistles go off. And so this is what I mean about judgment too. Instead of like a person, if you can even imagine a time before screens and people would think about something like climate change and they would have a different rhythm and way of thinking about something. Whereas with screens, it just becomes more like which buttons do I push to make the lights flash, essentially. And so your phone and your technology starts to train you. And I don't know what's going to happen with AI, but that's a whole
Yeah.
different level of
No,
that.
I completely agree. And I feel like I came across a thinker whose name I don't remember. There was a law around this preceding iPhones, really talking about any time that you're using technology or technology is training you, and you are adapting your neurology to your technology, whatever that is.
Right, and it's yeah, and you think like your phone's there to tell you like how to get to the restaurant and but it's actually the other way around. It's
Yeah.
training you how to take care of it, how to charge it in certain ways. You kind of change your patterns about that, and all those sorts of things. And there's this basic question about does technology is just it is just a tool, in the end. And so the question is, what does the tool serve? And does it serve what we want it to serve, you know? Or is it a tool for people who want to sell you things and, other things like that? Um, so, yeah, and then behind that is this whole issue about our stories and why do we have tools, and what are the values they serve? Like we might call them human values, or I don't know what the word is. But do the things we do actually serve something we've thought about versus just something we're reactive to?
This is cool. I mean, we could those are really great questions, and we can tie it even back to the beginning where we're talking about these emotions and the cerebellum and how we evolve. Because one of the hallmarks of the expansion of the human nervous system was our ability to develop and use tools. And I think there are other species who do this in a primitive way, but we kind of nailed that one, no pun intended. And so it's the outside of the cerebellum that's really helping us do this fine tune thing. It's really the left hemisphere of the brain, which actually crosses over to the right cerebellum, that's interested in using tools to change and conquer our environment. So there's
Yeah.
really a set of values that are set in there, and I know you've been wanting to talk about stories for quite a while, and so I was
Oh my
doing a
god.
little bit of, refreshment of my notes because I wanted to get this right, but in terms of how our brain perceives reality, it's our right hemisphere that's much more in touch with reality, and it's our left hemisphere that's much more interested in the virtual world. So
Right.
we can talk about the whole range of human experience, but when you talk about things like mental illness and let's say like OCD versus psychosis, that you might have a flavor of OCD where you're doing these repetitive behaviors that you can't control, but you're aware that if you step on a crack, you're not really going to break your mom's back, but you can't help it. Versus psychosis, where you've lost touch with reality and you are not able to, yeah, to kind of sense that difference. And so it's the difference between having being kind of locked into your left hemisphere, which is folks who are addicted to video games, into virtual things. That's going to be that pattern versus right hemisphere, which can kind of sometimes when it's imbalanced become hyper
Right.
real and
And
get
the
anxious.
and the and the left brain thinks it's really describing the actual world, you know?
It it does, or
Or
it's just more interested in the abstract world. So like it's interested in that separation, or it's interested in itself. It's the separate hemisphere. It's locked in and it's more interested in what it knows
how
than
let
what
me ask you this, What's the difference between how the way the right brain tells stories and how the left brain creates and tells stories?
Yes, that's actually an interesting question. So the right brain is what can make inferences and metaphors and connections. The left hemisphere is very literal. So if you get someone who's left hemisphere dominant, they're not very good at understanding sarcasm, for example. So
Mhm.
the right hemisphere is where metaphors live, where poetry lives. And so it can tell stories, and it can do it with like verbal parsimony, so it's connected to reality, and then it can tell stories about it to connect with it. The left hemisphere, it's like more abstract, but again, it may be thinking that the story is the real thing
And
and not
how about
realize
the
that it's.
difference of the use of language, words?
Yeah, so I would say, as a generalization, for most, and again, this is for most people, for 95% of people, our verbal, centers live in the left
On the
hemisphere.
left, yeah,
So some people will be familiar with something called Broca's area, so that's for expressive language, and
right. So when
Wernicke's
you
area.
see people with strokes and they're having it's been in that area and they can't form a word or they can't yeah,
Right, and this happened to my grandfather. So,
yeah.
Wernicke's area is more for receptive language, but we do have the equivalent on the right hemisphere, but they're nonverbal. They're more for implicit language.
This is so
So
interesting because, we talk about in aging text archaeology, one of the big themes is the world before the veil and the world after the veil, which is the world of things and events and the world of patterns of motion and transformation and breath. When you look at the early writings, like it's like I keep coming back to the Tao Te Ching in the first chapter where it says, the Tao that can be seen as a thing is not that's not it because it's a pattern of motion. And then the name that can be named is not the
yes,
name. So they go right, and then they say there's two worlds. There's the world without words or names or things, and there's the world that has names and things. They actually both come from the same mother, but they're two different things. And
yes,
when you go to even to like, for example, the Old Testament, and they say, "In the beginning was the Word."
yes,
Or even if you look at the story of Adam and Eve, which is so interesting, and you think of what happened when the apple was bitten into, and all of a sudden, what happened? They were aware of their nakedness,
yeah,
and so somehow there's this transition between immersive patterning and motion and transformational events and thing-based language things, and it's there. I think that's what we're having so much trouble with right now. Is we never got the operating manual of the human brain to understand how these events work. I don't know what you think about that.
yeah. It's like the neurology of the Tao Te Ching, and then some of the philosophical implications. Because I think about these things deeply, which is that in some ways it's like we didn't get the training manual, but also the other paradox that I see is that the way our modern societies are set up is that the people who are have learned to be most successful, whatever that means, whether that's accumulating wealth or influencing people through communication or whatever that is, are strong in certain areas, but those may not be the same
Right.
areas as folks who can understand the movement of the
They may not be
clouds.
the people we want to lead things.
Right. And leadership, that this is another really interesting area, where you talk about, let's say, like, mindful leadership or heart-based leadership, or even there's an area of psychology that I'm very interested in called internal family systems. And it's really about what we talk about in nature-based medicine, which is that the heart is the ruler, the emperor, which means that it is the rightful leader of the system. It doesn't mean that it's, like, better than, or any of those things. It just means that there's a hierarchy, like a natural hierarchy, and that it is the rightful leader, and unfortunate things happen when other parts of the body, other parts of our personality, other types of people step into leadership roles. They may have characteristics that make them good at certain things, but which might be including getting power. but it doesn't mean that they necessarily have the qualities that we would look for in,
Right,
you know,
in a
the
heartbeat,
most wise
heartbeat.
and caring and effective
It's
leader.
also like when we ask, like, "What is a diseased tissue?" And we say, "Well, one of the criteria is it lacks breath and circulation and light," but it is the other is it's self-focused, and
Mm.
the thing about heart-based, life is that it's actually the center of the coherence, and so, when we come from heart-based leadership, it's actually taking into account all parts, whereas if you have someone who's self-focused who like certain politicians, I won't name, who are recently president or are currently president, um, they, and when we see that, that doesn't actually serve us very well. But we have a system that rewards that kind of behavior
It's
to rise in power in a certain
it
way.
it's challenging. I mean, for example, some of the strengths of this, this personality or this system or this part of all of us that we have, one is that they're very good at listening. And what that can mean is that they take longer to answer or that they don't say as
Right.
much
And they
or
don't
they're
have
not
you don't always have an immediate answer, you know.
right. And so if you're in a culture that I think a lot of people know better, but if you have a media that's trying to manipulate people and to say, "Oh, they took a little while to answer that. They're weak, they're stupid, they're slow," or whatever, and criticizing being thoughtful and being listening, it makes it very hard for people who are truly wise to win or be successful.
It's almost we've gotten to a place where it's almost impossible. And the thing we can rely on, the only thing we can rely on is the deeper currents that write patterns of motion, that are in nature. And one of the crisis problems right now is that we don't have a problem with information. Like we have way too much information already. AI, we don't actually need more information. I mean, there's positive things AI can do, but information is not what we're lacking at the moment. We're drowning in disorganized pieces of information that are not organized to serve human life in a certain way. And so, so in one sense, we're drowning in a flood of information. What we have a drought of is heart based stories or deeper stories that can organize that information. They're almost non existent right now. And I think that that's kind of what people feel as an anxiety. It's like I'm
Mm.
overwhelmed in information, but we don't even know, like, for example, does technology serve you or do you serve it? We don't even know what we are. Like, how would technology serve us? What does it mean to serve us? It doesn't just mean to make more money or to become more popular. What does it mean to serve human values, whatever those things are? You know,
Mm.
and that's where I think we're really flailing. We don't have stories to organize them to evaluate something and say, yes, that's we should go that way. No, we shouldn't. Yeah, it's a real crisis at the moment.
It's funny you bring something up, really important because we've been wanting to talk a bit about stories, and there's a really great author she's a writing coach. Her name is Lisa Cron, and she's written a couple of interesting books. One's called Story or Die, and she talks about that we actually get our sense of identity from our stories, which I know you talk a lot about. And so it's almost this like this inferential loop where we don't know who we are. We're looking, let's say, to our technology to tell us,
Right.
and
And
then it feeds back.
it's just, and like it's one way when we're so transfixed by watching, Netflix or things like that over and over again. One is because we want to like get out of the real world because it's not so great right now. But the other thing is when we watch stories in front of us, they help us reform our own stories. That's what the role plays used to have,
Y-
You would
it-
see someone act out of something and it would help you reform your own story. But we don't actually even have the criteria. This is what I mean about not being good with the human brain in terms we didn't get the operating manual. We don't even have the criteria to evaluate which is a better story. We are story-based creatures. Like if you look at, what's the difference between a human being and a butterfly, or a deer? It's not that we're not animals. We are. We're part of the great ape family, right? What's the difference between us and a chimpanzee? Well, they have tools, they have families, they have sex, they have emotions, all that kind of stuff. They don't tell stories.
Mm.
So, stories came from language. So it's really this advent of language, which is very recent, which is the hallmark. Besides our ability to make tools that kind of can do all sorts of things, it's about that language. But what we don't have is the deeper wisdom of how to formulate stories, what they are. We think stories are something that are made up,
Yeah.
and not real. But so we have a lot of growth there.
Mhm. I mean, well, one thing that, stories allowed us to do is to learn from experience that was not from our own mistakes. So, we
Exactly,
could
and
we
particularly
could
like
do
written language, well, actually, verbal language handed
yeah,
down
we could
through
have this, like,
cultures.
hypothesis testing going, "Well, if you do this, that'll happen, but you don't actually have to do that." And there's also this interesting connection here as well where when we talk about I'm very interested in human evolution in as much as that our individual stories are like mirrored in it as we develop, and I tend to look at disease. We mentioned where the breath is not moving, but in terms of kind of these larger arcs is where our complexity has become decreased, right? And that's also part of that kind of that inhale and become more complex and there's more nuance, and then as the exhale happens, things become more simple.
Uh,
But the connection, one of the kind of big cruxes that kind of ties all of this together, is that something happened when we stood up on 2 feet, which is another human trick, where we had this expansion in our cerebellum to keep our balance. And this is actually going back full circle to the motions you were talking about, because the cerebellum is and the brainstem has a very specific role to play in going from being on 4 legs to 2 legs, that we actually have to uh, disengage these front muscles here so that they can come back and our shoulder blades come back, and then we can stand up and balance. And that is intimately related to the expansion in our brain for language and for tools and for fine motor control and for stories. So it's gonna, probably eventually I'll come back to making these solar motions. And also I'm gonna put a plug in for, and see if you if when you hear this idea it resonates. There are a lot of really cool things out there that I think just need to become a little bit more specific and tailored to the person. And we talk about this a little bit, but for example, whether it's a qigong practice or a yoga practice, it tends to be practiced in a fairly balanced way. So you're going to do something on the left, and you're going to do something on the right. You're going to twist to the right. You're going to twist to the left. But most people are walking around pretty twisted already, and this is mirrored in our, wacky brain traits and being on the spectrum, and the health issues we have and how it affects our heart, because all of the impulse to our heart is coming from these different sides. And so I'm going to put like a vote for developing, as you develop this style, you might say to people, okay, just go start with the sun on the east and go to the west, but then also let's see if your eastern side is a bit weaker and we can maybe do a few more reps on that
oh,
side.
that's a whole different thing, and those solar motions, they define how a body moves through three-dimensional space along six axes of motion, and how nature moves in six axes of motion. That's a whole other thing, and it's led to clinical evaluation, because once you see those motions and you know what they look like, then when the patient walks in the room, or you see someone walking, you can go, wow, that one is really off.
See
And
someone walking. This
right.
is
And just you just say bend over, turn to the left, turn to the right, but actually you just see them walk in the room, and then you work on those, and they're very simple in a certain way. They're based in sinew muscle systems and so forth. um, and by the way, um, what does the Neijing say about what your heart is in nature?
what your heart is in nature.
It's the sun.
Sun, it's the light. Yeah, it's the
Yeah,
sun.
so, here's a very interesting thing about all this, about climate change, politics, stories, AI, blah, blah, blah. Everything that happens is from natural patterns. So our ability, our desire to take resources, to make them, to choke ourselves with plastics, to have strange politics, it's all part of how nature unfolds. And we and our natural world are overall a process of the universe recreating itself along its original patterns. So from a farther back view, this is all like, for example, we talked about adolescence. Adolescence is a phase of nature's breath where you are leaving the root of your home and you're pushing against something, and you have to leave something to do that. So that pushing against your parents and saying you don't know anything and I know everything and I have all the answers and I'm impervious
I'm a
to anything.
I'm a 5-year-old adolescent.
Right. That's all part of breath, actually. And if you look at like a Western culture, and like we know everything and we can control nature and it's all about the
Exponential
eastern
growth.
phases. Oh, it's all about growth. Does that remind you of anybody? It's a teenager. Like in cultural ways, we're in a very early growth phases. And when you get to become an adult, what's the marker of that? Well, the world's not all about me. I have to consider different points of view, blah, blah, blah. We're still at an early stage of our evolution that way. But going back to what we started with, which was the doing the qigong in the garden with the solar motions, what I'm doing when I feel the sun, I lay in the sun with my olive oil bergamot alcohol mix. It's nice for the skin. And then I do the motions of with the sun. I face the sun or face south, either way. And then I'm actually reproducing the motions of what nature is doing all around me in my garden and in the world as the sun moves. But in my body, in my natural ecology, the heart is the sun. So I'm kind of linking the sun of my heart with the sun of nature. And then the whole thing about that is that we are not things, but we're coherences of breath formed around light. And that light springs from the heart. So when we go, and that goes back also to, does technology work for you or do you work for it? Or what's a good story and what's not a good story? Well, good stories are ones that are based around light and coherence and breath. And if you want to know like what is a good human value, you can say justice, all those kinds of things. But what it boils down to is that there's stories that emphasize light, coherence, and breath. So when we're doing that, it's a very simple thing. But and this is really our challenge. It's like we don't need more information. We don't need faster internet speeds. We don't need any of that stuff. What we need is a deeper understanding of stories that put that information together and serve something. So that's it's kind of an exciting time to and a nerve-wracking time to be alive.
Exciting time. Let's do that.
We never got to even there was a whole other topic I know kind of done for today for a brunch talk, but there's a there's a whole other interesting topic which I know you and I talked about, which is that when you study nature, and we go back to nature by the way to rewrite our stories because that's where the original patterns are. But one of the things when you're studying nature is you get an eye for nature's design. And that means you see the basic patterns of how it opens and closes and things like, and then you start to see it in things. And boy, do you see it in the brain.
Yeah.
And we've talked about that, but and one of the main patterns is root branch expression. That breath comes out of root and branch, and the cerebellum really does seem to be like the root of the brain. And then the brain is just unfolded and has all these networks that actually can unfold from the cerebellar root. I don't know. Do you agree with that?
I completely agree with that. It's funny, I I'm enjoying learning the nervous system so much and having the principles that continuously learn and get kind of deeper understanding of with the Neijing nature-based medicine means that I have this really solid ground to stand on as I'm trying to understand something because you can always understand it from a first principles perspective. And I do feel that it's important that it is important for humans to really understand how the brain and the nervous system work. And so I'm kind of working on understanding it well enough. Well, A, I'm already using it clinically, but then to teach it. And one of the beautiful things about learning the nervous system, it is learnable, especially if you understand some of these first principles. But one of the things that's confusing is all the names and terms. But as it turns out,
The
a lot of
details.
the yeah, with those details, right? But a lot of the terms, they might be named after someone, okay, but they are from botany or they're from nature, and it really is that simple. That the Sokai and Gyri are mountains and valleys, and then you have, like, in the cerebellum, you've got three peduncles. That's a botany term, for these kind of
Right.
branches that come out. It is really all based on that, and even the outer layer of the brain, it's called the cortex, which is the bark. But I think, from my understanding of studying with you, I think of it more as the crown of the
Crown branching.
tree, the crown branching
Yeah.
of the tree. But you're if you understand it that way, you're not gonna go too far. And honestly, I teach my patients how the nervous system works and how the brain works, and they probably have a better understanding of it than most clinicians. But this is really useful information to kind of to fill in some of that missing owner's manual that we weren't given, because it's gonna be relevant for a lot of health things that people are trying to understand and navigate.
And also in practical terms, I mean, as we were talking in the beginning, the cerebellum is not the main actor in Western thought. It's like there's people who study it and that's their deal and so forth, but that's not where we're looking. But when you look at nature's design and root and branch expression, you say the cerebellum is actually the root. Well, what's the main principle of like healthcare and working in a deeper way? Start with the root. And
Start
if you
with the
start with
root.
the yeah, and if you start with the root, then everything that comes after that is put in alignment.
Yeah, I mean, I when I was first studying it, I was thinking of the brainstem as the root, and the cerebellum seems to be slightly on top of that. So I'm trying to think of if there's I feel like maybe I'm missing the metaphor that I'm really wanting to have to really understand how this works, because the brainstem is kind of the difference between life and death. The cerebellum, every single sensory input is going through the cerebellum. The cerebellum's going in and out with the brainstem, and then it's going up and it's going down. It's more foundational than the cortex, so it's still an open question for me.
You know, yeah, I'm trying to think about in nature, and it's also that we're getting off topic a little bit, maybe, but the brain is actually, if the cerebellum's a root, well, the main root's down in your pelvis of your body. This is like something that's happening way up on the trunk, which is your spine, and there we see things like crown branching. And leaves, for example, form out there, and but also fruit, fruiting, and which is an extension of inner, deeper root externalized,
Mm.
or like your ovaries or testicles are like that too. They're the fruit of you. And I wonder if we can think about that and talk about it another
Yeah,
time.
and there's definitely this fractal component, where because it's really, again, I think that from the perspective of the nervous system, it's all about creating more detailed and accurate maps, right? And so in the cerebellum, you've got quite a few somatotopic maps, and also emotional mapping. I mean, all sorts of things. So you have, like, some people are familiar with this idea of the homunculus, which is like the little mapping of the guy on the sensory and motor cortices. But we also have quite a few of them in the cerebellum as well. So, yeah, I don't know if it's the root, or maybe if the brainstem is like the root that goes down into the ground, and the cerebellum is coming up. But there's definitely a very important role with us being upright. And one of the reasons why it became very relevant to me is one of the things that I'd been battling for ages was something called postural hypotension, which is when anytime I stood up or got up, my blood pressure would go down. It's supposed to go up. And even though I wasn't really falling over, it was just I felt kind of broken. And I was getting dizzy and it was unpleasant. And I went to specialists. I did all sorts of things. And it wasn't until I figured out how to stimulate my cerebellum. And then I went back to the literature, and there it is. It's like it has a nucleus in it that is fine tuning blood pressure. It is adjusting to postural changes. But whenever I hear postural changes, I think of being more complex because this is that connection again that humans are a bit unique in that we are upright and bipedal, and so there and when we're babies we're not, and then we develop into it, and when we are sick we kind of need to lie down again, and when we get old we kind of get hunched over. So it's like this theme of something very centrally important, that when the brain decides that it's just not doing well, it's going to make you kind of wither. So
This is really interesting, and maybe this is a good point to wrap it up today. But one thing I'm thinking about the relationships between stories and the cerebellum, and I've been in practice forever. Like I don't know how many patients I've seen in my life, and the way I've seen practice and health and illness has changed radically. But one of the things that and I talk now about that health is about freeing illuminative beauty, which means light is emanating. But another thing I found a lot more helpful, instead of thinking about what is true, think about how it changes how we move through the world. And so, like this, for example, you could know something true and move through the world in a very bad way, so that your life doesn't feel very good. You have pain, but you know something that's true, right? I don't mean make things up, by the way. We'll talk about that when we talk about stories. But there's different ways you can organize the way you see things, which makes you move through the world differently. So, like when you change a story, for example, one of the things it changes is it changes how you move through the world. But the cerebellum is almost like the anatomical correlate to that about how you move through space. And these things about the sun and the primary solar motions, it's all about and that's really what we want as human beings. We want to move through the world in a rich experiential way, full of love and experience, and so that at the end of our life, we've really lived it. So it's all coming together.
it's all coming together. I think that's a beautiful note to
At least
conclude
on
on.
a podcast, it's coming together.
Yes,
Well, that's
very
great. Well,
cool.
I'll look forward to seeing you next time, and we'll get more into stories. That's just such a fascinating thing, and I think
Absolutely.
the stories are they're our Achilles heel. They take us down, and they're our salvation. Yeah.
Amen.
Amen. All right. See you next time.